All right. So the first exercise that we're going to do for today is dealing with exporting out a short video clip based on your masking design that you've done inside of After Effects. Now, there are a few points that you want to sort of check up on when dealing with this process. And to sort of frame that correctly for what we're working with today, I do have the demo file up in front of me, and I'm just using assets from that file in mine. You are welcome to work with your own media if you want to today, or you can also sort of follow around with parts of the actual demo file. In my demo file, I have a completed masked out shape on screen, you may notice. So I've got masks for basically every form on the object from the reference image that was loaded in. Again, you are welcome to work with your own if you like today. But I've done that part. I also have in my timeline sort of a sort of sound audio section sort of screened out and created so that's kind of sequenced and ready for me down below. So I played that out a bit. Remember, in your own project, the bedrock and foundation of an audio visualized piece is the audio. So make sure that you have that established before you start dropping in all kinds of crazy video and animation media inside of your work, because it should always be interpreted up from the audio in the concept of our project. Okay, so here are some checkpoints to deal with before exporting a test copy of your video for reprojecting on your object before getting to the real thing. So what we've done from the last time we worked with masking was we established all of our masks, and we put below each object or each mask a placeholder color fill shape or solid layer. And so I have each of those positioned underneath masks relative to them. We use the track matte effect for individual surfaces. So we did that by drawing an independent shape layer, and then we put below that shape layer a solid. That way it could show through the hole. We then changed the track matte selection for the solid color that shows through to the alpha matte for whatever the layer was directly above it. And that's what track mattes do, if we recall. We also had our top level mask, which was alpha matted or stencil alpha, so that it would cut out all the excess background junk, so we wouldn't have that reprojected in our scene. And again, when you're quality checking your file, make sure that you have all of your individual surfaces mapped out at this stage. That will help to make sure that your actual reprojected image matches. Because it's one thing to have the perimeter match accurately, but it's another for all the internal parts to actually connect together and be at the right positions. So you want to make sure that you have, if there are in your design of your object, any individual areas, make sure they're mapped out. So that you have those accurately noted and accurately visualized. All right. Another point to check, and hopefully you have this accurately put out there the first time, is to make sure that the size of your comp window, your resolution dimensions of your shape, is correct. If you want to check the composition settings, always go up to Composition. From the top menu, go to Composition Settings, and double check these two numbers for width and height. If your width should say 1024 and your height ought to say 768. If those numbers are not accurate, you will need to change them. But to be honest with you, the moment that you have to switch these numbers usually causes problems in the design that you've already created. For instance, here, I'll go ahead and flip it out just so you can see what happens. So I'm going to switch this to widescreen. Let's say I made that big mistake, and I needed a widescreen design. So I'm going to choose this HD TV 1080p, and I'm going to say OK. And what's great is that it doesn't look like much has happened, right? Except that my pixel area has grown significantly around the borders. And I now have extra headroom around my object, right? So it didn't change the pixel size of any of my graphic assets. That's kind of nice, but the problem is that if I have to rescale any of this stuff at this stage, it can get super messy. And you really, really, really don't want to have to do that to your project. There are ways to circumvent or navigate that if it's something as simple as this, which we can revisit when we get to output files and formats. But at this stage, you just want to make sure everything fits inside that 1024 by 768 area. All right, so I undid what I just did there, so we're back to normal now. Okay, so you get that part rigged. Now, if you come down into your timeline area, we want to make sure that for all of our masks and solid shape layers that we've dropped in, that they at least play for the first 10 to 15 seconds of our timeline. So if you design them without changing anything like we did last class, they should stretch from the beginning of your timeline all the way to the end automatically. When you add static imagery layers like drawn shapes into an After Effects timeline, they automatically are lengthened to the entire length of the timeline by proxy. And so unless you start doing things like this, where you trim down the in or out points, they should be fine where they're at. But make sure that whenever you drag your playhead for the first 10 to 15 seconds, that these things are all visible inside this window and not moving. They should not move. Make sure that they are playing from the very beginning, too. I'm going to go ahead and shrink my work area. That's this gray bar right here, or render area is another way to understand this bar. But I'm going to grab it and drag it back to where it only shows a rendered area for the first 10 to 15 seconds. Again, I'm going to put it at about 15 because it's the one ruler marker that I have on screen to go by, unless I zoom in. But I'm going to leave it at this, about 15 seconds. Again, you can do 10 seconds. I think that's what it says in the instructions, so either is perfectly fine. But I'm going to shorten that down so that I can tell After Effects when I export my work that I only want this little region rendered. And that's what it's going to read whenever you send it out of the system, is wherever this bar is positioned. So we get that set into position. One other thing to do at this stage in your timeline, since we're on it, is turn off temporarily any audio or video media or any excess layers that are not a part of this, any part of these masks or temporary placeholder shapes. So in my timeline, I've got a ton of audio that is down at the bottom turned on, and I'm just going to flip all of those speakers off, drag my mouse down them, and turn them off. If you have video layers that you have dropped in, go ahead and turn them off, okay? For exporting purposes, for a short clip like this, we don't need all of that on. It will make After Effects work twice as hard to read your video layers. Even if they're not visible on top, it still has to read every single frame of media that is present inside the timeline. So you want to make sure you're not rendering excess stuff. I'll put it that way. So turn all of that stuff off. Look through your timeline and turn them off. All right. Once you got that established, there's really not much more we have to do as far as quality checking over the file. We're pretty much good to go at this stage. And now we can go ahead and export out a copy. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to File. And I'm going to go down to Export. And we're going to send it out of After Effects and into what's called Adobe Media Encoder. This is a standalone software encoding project software. So it allows you to send audio or video related files to get re-encoded to different formats, or to add compression to the files, again, for different purposes, like displaying on the web, broadcast, or just putting away for archival purposes. All of that stuff is possible through Adobe Media Encoder. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this option that says Add to Adobe Media Encoder. And if you're opening it for the first time, Adobe Media Encoder might take a minute to open if it is not pre-opened on your computer. Now I had mine pre-opened, so it opened up instantly. But if you're using it for the first time in a lab or at home or wherever, it's going to take a moment for it to preload the software like any creative program. So you may be waiting a minute for it to load up on your app bar. But it is this little icon down here that looks like a purple halftone icon square that sort of fades out from pixels into a solid region, just so you're familiar with what it looks like. Okay, so here's Media Encoder. It's a pretty straightforward little program. It's not meant to do anything really fancy except export files. That's pretty much it. Now, we don't have to do a whole lot in here, except that we're going to make two separate file formats to output from Media Encoder. The first one we want to get, mine's not set to, so I'm going to quickly change it, but yours should be. If you're the first time opening this, it'll probably be set to format should be H.264 in this Q window over on the upper left. The preset will probably say match source high bitrate, and then it'll give you some kind of location for output file. Now most of that is ready for our first file format, which is the H.264 format. It makes a .mp4 file, or MPEG-4, which is an Apple format. The only thing we're going to change here is where it saves it. Okay, so under output file, there's a string of blue text. Click on that blue text, and that should open up a Save As command window. If your window's minimized like mine, you can actually expand it with the little arrow here next to the Save As name. And when exporting video, please export it to your desktop. Do not send it to a portable thumb drive. You can export out to a Thunderbolt or USB 3.0 connected portable hard drive, like larger drives. Your little thumb drive cannot handle, usually can't handle very effectively large video outputs. So send it directly to the shortest bridge of communication, which is either straight to the computer's hard drive you're working on, or to the fastest connection through a good solid state hard drive or something like that. So I'm going to use desktop from the selection, and I'm going to rename it at the top to mapping test. Again, that's all that this file is going to stand for. This is not a file that you're required to turn in. This is just for testing, reprojecting back on your object. So I'll call it mapping test and then hit save, and that'll be good to go in the system. And from here, there's not really much more we have to do except hit the green play button, which begins the encoding process. So that's right up here in the top of the Q window. Start that, and it should run pretty fast down in the bottom of your screen on the lower right, left. So you should notice it has a long blue bar. Now, this will change dramatically when you output your final project. This will go slower. Because it will be based on all kinds of media it's trying to generate individual frame drawings for, and that's how the encoder works. When it's done, it should turn blank, and whatever you encoded from your file selection in the queue should turn gray up above. And now what we do is we always make sure the file we outputted actually plays back. So I'm going to minimize my Media Encoder, minimize After Effects, minimize Blackboard, and eventually get to wherever my file is. And there it is on my desktop. There's my MP4. So I'm just going to select it and hit spacebar to preview. And it should play back what looks like a still image on screen for a long duration of time. That's what you should be seeing. If you see anything else going on in your design right now, then that's a problem. If anything is moving, if you have shapes disappearing and reappearing over time, that's a problem. That means you've got animation or sporadically clipped tracks throughout your timeline. And you may want to go back into After Effects at that point and make sure that everything in your timeline for these test images are correct. But otherwise, it should just play quite simply. Now, that's the first file format, okay? So let's go ahead and get the second one outputted from the system. So we're going to go back to Media Encoder, and we're just going to duplicate what we had from last time and make some changes to the settings this time. So the second file type we need to make is a QuickTime file, or a .mov. .mov QuickTime is an Apple-specific format. It's also a format we typically work with a lot in this department. And you'll find a lot on kind of external video equipment and those things that output a simple file. So I want to make sure you know how to make that. So select this last file that was created inside of QuickTime, and it should be grayed out when you select it. And what you want to do is hit Command D on your keyboard to duplicate it. And that will pop out a brand new copy. And what I want you to do is from here, we're going to make some changes because the format we need needs to be different. So where it says format, over here on the side, we're going to click on H.264 where it's in blue. So click on the actual word H.264. If you click on the pull down, you're not going to have the options we need to work with because we've got to make some more tight-knit adjustments than what this gives us. So click on the actual blue letter text for H.264 and that will bring up a separate export window like this. All right. Now this is the actual export settings window that you would get if you were inside of other external programs like Adobe Premiere or even in After Effects. So this window will pop up and I want you to look over here on the upper right where it says export settings, and we're going to start up here to make adjustments. So up here where it says format, we're going to switch it out to QuickTime. And a quick note on that, if you are a Windows user like outside of this classroom lab, bear in mind that QuickTime is not a normal format available. It's just one of those things, if you don't have QuickTime installed on the computer, sometimes the encoder is not automatically available because it is an Apple-based product. It's really annoying. But if that is you, again, and you're working at home on your project for any reason for the export, you may need to go and download QuickTime to get that onto your machine. But there's no promise that it will just automatically input the encoder into all of the exporter software that's on there. So I've kind of seen mixed results with that. Worst case scenario is you come up to class to export a file or into the lab to do that. But that's just to keep in mind so you have a copy of that format available. Again, the QuickTime format is one that I'm showing because it is one that is used in our department for things like CPR, portfolio reviews, or even in the video department. That's a fairly common format that's outputted and used a lot. So just bear that in mind. Okay, QuickTime. Now, once you do QuickTime, it might shift some of the settings on screen, like your preview window over on the side. It might change it to a widescreen format. We're going to change the preset below the format up here. So I'm going to go to where it says preset, and I'm going to go to match source rewrap. And when I click on that, After Effects will basically do its best to rematch all of our original After Effects settings into the QuickTime file. Now it gives you a preview in this window of what's occurring here. Like if you look where it says summary down below, there's a box here that says summary, and it tells you what your output settings are going to be for your new file and what the original source settings in your After Effects file are set to. So if those don't match up, then there's problems. But for the most part, they match up. There's things that are nuances that don't need to carry off into the output file or from the source file, but so long as the pixel dimensions and the frame rate, the field setting, which right now says progressive, are the same, then you should be okay. The only other thing I want to change on the screen is come down a little further to where it shows some tabs, and there's one for video that's active. And it probably says down there, there's a button in white text that says match source down there. Click on that button that says match source. And when you click on match source, it unlocks the video codec dropdown. This is important to be able to edit because right now it's using an uncompressed file quality, and the problem with that is that it could take a long time to make an uncompressed QuickTime file, and a much larger file at that, and we don't need that. So we're going to change the video codec now. So click on the pull down for video codec and drag it down to H.264 as well. All right. And then come down a little further and you're going to adjust the basic video settings where it says quality. Drag that slider all the way up to 100. And that's all you need to do. And then you can go to the bottom and say OK. And now we can go ahead and hit play. We don't have to worry about setting the output file location because it's the same as last time since we duplicated. So hit the green button to play it back to start the encode, and it will start rendering out your QuickTime file. Yep.
Why not just do it through After Effects? Why use Media?
Because After Effects is a good question. Why not do it through After Effects? So Adobe, for one reason or another, decided it was smart to remove certain formats from direct software exporting. So it used to be in After Effects you could output any file format that was available in Media Encoder. Well, they did away with that, and they narrowed down the export options to about a smaller handful. And one of those, unfortunately, happens to be the H.264 format, which we need. Again, it makes a compressed file that's smaller, more usable, and user-friendly. Most people, when using After Effects, they like to output like a big, chunky, archivable file that you can use in broadcast production. So you never make anything that's really small, but we are. So that's why we send it to Media Encoder, so you can see that. Now, the benefits of knowing Media Encoder is that you can transform and convert almost any kind of audio or video file in here to a different format, which I've done with legacy formats from older cameras to get a file I can still use. So I've used Media Encoder to do that a lot. So sometimes that's when it plays out, though. Okay, now that you got that file outputted, you can go ahead and check it back on your desktop and make sure that your MOV plays without any interruptions, and there's no black frames playing. It's just your image straight up on screen for the whole duration. You got that? You're in good shape. All right, looks pretty good. Okay, so and again, with working through the exporting, this is kind of mirroring what's occurring inside of the export instructions document. If you're in Blackboard, for this part of the assignment, there is a document linked under the masking section down towards the end of the masking instructions that talks about export a 10-second video clip, and you can use this export doc, a little link right there, that will give you a document that looks like this. And it pretty much runs you through the same process of sending a file to Media Encoder, and exporting an H.264 and a QuickTime file. Again, the only nuances you should pay attention to are like the things where we actually are only doing about 10 to 15 seconds of audio of the piece we're exporting, right? This document is very specific to like the final output of your final work, which again is something we'll cover in more detail when we do the output formats demo later. But to give you a taste of it, again, you can follow the instructions in here pretty much to get the same file out. All right. So we're going to go ahead and probably stop this particular video at that stage, just so you know, like again, like how to output or export your video, and again, just the short clip version of it for testing your masks up against your original object. All right. And when we come back, we'll take a look at working in some of the other areas with the timeline and with video.